In this video, we'll talk about multiplying and dividing integers. So before we begin talking about what happens with negatives, let's talk about what would happen with positives and just kind of reason out what multiplication is on a fundamental level. So if we look at 3 times 5, what this really means is that you have 3 groups of 5. So I have 5 plus 5 plus 5. It's that repeated addition thing, which I'm sure we can all agree that makes 15. And this is one way of thinking about it. 3 is how many groups I have, and the 5 is the size of each group. And this thought will apply very well to when we deal with negatives. So let's look at a negative case. Let's say I'm multiplying 3 times a negative 5. Well, that's the same thing as negative 5 plus a negative 5 plus a negative 5, which also makes negative 15. And it would make sense if I multiply a positive times a negative, well, the product will be negative. And this trend holds true for all numbers. Even if the negative was first, I could rewrite it the other way. I could do 5 groups of negative 3. I would still get negative 15. But what happens if they're both negative? And this one's a little more difficult to reason out. So a lot of textbooks will just tell you, yeah, it's 15. Now, the reason for a negative times a negative being a positive is a little difficult to explain. So I'll go into it here on the video, but if you're cool with just accepting negative times a negative makes a positive, that's fine. So I'm going to break this up just a little bit differently. So let's rewrite this as negative 3 times 1 minus 6. Now if we look at this, that makes negative 5. So it might seem a little strange, but what I'm going to try and do first is do distributive property. So I'm going to multiply the 3 times both of these things. Now if I take negative 3 times a positive 1, that makes negative 3. And then I'm going to minus, take the negative 3 times the positive 6, that makes negative 18. And if we look at this, this becomes negative 3 plus 18, which makes a positive 15. Now all of this we would never do, to just simply multiply 2 negative numbers. It's just kind of a way to justify how it pans out. It just so happens that it turns out to be positive. So if you have 2 negative numbers, you can multiply them just like they'd be positives and just leave it alone, if that's what you prefer. So the rules for division follow very similarly to multiplication. If I take, say, 15 divided by 5, that makes 3. Likewise, if I take negative 15 divided by 5, that makes a negative 3. And we kind of talked about that in general. And then if we have negative or positive 15, or negative 15 divided by a negative 5, that makes a positive 3. So in general, with division, a positive divided by a positive makes positive. A negative divided by a positive, or a positive divided by a negative, that makes negative. And if you have a negative divided by a negative, that makes positive. And if you're curious as to why this is, just take a look back at our multiplication problems. They follow very similarly from there. But this will be our generic go-to for determining signs when we're doing operations with integers.